So when I was in college, I was a junior, and around that time, they were saying like you got to pick your internship for your summer break between junior year and senior year. And I was
Mm-hmm.
majoring in kinesiology with a concentration on exercise science. And so the
Nice.
traditional route was, okay, we'll find a physical therapy office,
Yep.
find like a patient, rehabilitation center, and work over there. And I'd already worked at a physical therapy office when I was a freshman in college, and really quickly grew to hate it, and was like so bored and didn't find it fun or engaging at all. And so at that time, I'd been keeping up with Super Training Gym and Mark Bell for years. So I knew he was kind of in my backyard in Sacramento. I was going
Mhm.
to college probably 40 minutes away from where Super Training Gym is at. And I had one professor that also was familiar with the YouTube channel, Mark's podcast, and all that stuff. So I said, hey, I know it's technically not an internship, and I have no idea if they even do internships there, but if I was able to do an internship at Super Training Gym over the summer, would you honor that as, to meet my internship requirement? And he said, I don't care what you do, but if you do anything at Super Training Gym, like I'll sign whatever needs to get signed, and we'll make sure that that counts as an internship. And
That's
so,
awesome.
long story short, I go to Super Training Gym. I get in contact with Smokey or Steven, and he said, okay, we'll come in for an interview. And I was like, okay. So I come in for an interview, which was basically just squatting. And he just like beat my legs to death with squats. And then that was basically the interview. And they said, like, we don't really have an internship here, but you can hang out and help out, and we'll give you like, these side odd jobs to do. And that's how it started. And that's how I originally met Smokey. And then we worked together at Slingshot for a number of years, and then we both branched off, and he started doing all this great stuff with Marek. I branched off and continued pursuing my own endeavors. But yeah, Smokey and I go way back.
Man, that's so
awesome.
cool. And similar backgrounds for you and I. I was a kinesiology major
Yeah.
too. Tried to go the PT route and got bored as shit very quickly, and decided, I'm going to do something different from outside of here. So very cool.
Thank you.
Well, I was going to edit out all that intro, but I think we'll just leave that in and we'll just keep rolling because that was perfect, man. That's awesome. I like that story. We had, who was it? Joey Munoz, who's a PhD, kind of similar, where he works with Lane Norton now. And he said that, like, all through his life, he looked up to Lane. He saw him on bodybuilding.com and everything. And then he just thought, you know what, screw it. I'm just going to reach out and ask if he has somebody, or if he can use any help on his team. And now he's, close with him, and he works along with his nutrition brand. And it's really cool when you hear stories like that, where, we always look at influencers or people that we look up to as like unobtainable. But sometimes if you just take the risk and you just ask, you build this whole life for yourself off of one question,
Absolutely. There are so many instances in my life where I feel like it's been one question or one conversation that's kind of like transcended into a major move for my career, or even if it didn't have anything to do with my career, just sprouted in an awesome working relationship with someone that, I used to think was like, that guy is, he's at that level. But really, if you just like put yourself out there and just kind of overcome some of those initial hurdles and just act like a professional, people are way cooler than you would expect them to be. People are oftentimes much more generous with their time when they see that you're young and you're hungry to learn things, and you're hungry to give back to the community and contribute in all these different ways. And it's pretty amazing how small the world gets when you just act like a professional and do good by everyone else around you.
Absolutely.
For sure. And Josh, you're pretty young, right? You 25, 26?
26, just turned 26.
Okay.
Yep.
Awesome.
We finally get someone younger than me on the podcast. I love that.
There you go. How old are you?
Yeah.
27.
Okay, right on.
Yeah.
And I'm about to be 35, so I'm an old ass man. And to be honest, I'm not in BJJ, and I do follow Mark peripherally, kind of. We have a relationship, but I hadn't heard of you until Smokey sent me over your stuff, and I just listened to both of your podcasts on Mark Bell's, and I was like, I was telling my wife, so I'm like, actually really excited about this. This is a really cool dude, and I was just listening. I'm like, you're humble, you're very well articulate, you're extremely polite, you're kind of what I would consider, a very high value male. And we don't see that a lot of times in younger guys. So not to kiss your ass too much at the beginning of this, but I was like, he impresses me a lot. Everything that I hear you talk about, the way you hold yourself, even our communications, like when you first wrote me, it was just so polite, complete sentences. Usually when I'm talking to young kids, I literally I'm on Urban Dictionary for half of the things that they're saying. I'm like, I don't know what that meant. I'm like, what the hell is a cap? I'm not wearing a hat. I don't know what you're talking about. And then I go look it up. But I don't know what it is about you, man, but I think that you've got a really good head on your shoulders. I'm happy to have this conversation.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm sure my mom and my dad would probably love you for saying that. I can't really take credit for much of that. It's really just my parents, and that's how they raised my brother and I. And it is kind of interesting to see, like, especially how culture has been shifting over the last 10 years, or at least, within the last 10 years that I've been paying attention to. And I see what you're saying, like all these young kids, like they don't like text or message with proper punctuation or like complete sentences. And sometimes, and maybe you guys get this a lot too on social media, people are asking questions about different things and you're like, where's the question? Like there needs to be a period or a comma in here. Is there a question in this message? I'm not entirely sure, but thank you. I appreciate those kind words.
Yeah.
Even and it's amazing. Go ahead, Adam.
I was gonna say, I think I listened to the entire podcast and didn't hear like one swear word out of him, which I'm terrible. I'm cussing the whole time on all my podcasts, but I was just like, this is a really well put together kid. I like this guy. And I'm not surprised that you've had so much success in a short time, because it just, kind of resonates, I think, with a lot of people, but it's also admirable and cool. So yeah, again, I'll stop kissing the ass now.
It's all good. I won't stop it anymore if you continue to do so throughout the rest of the show. It's all good by me.
All right. But yeah, I kind of wanted to touch on and focus on that at least for a little bit, because I do see that it seems like you had pretty significant growth, and even though it started from a school assignment, you had to have some kind of drive and ambition and desire to go do more with your life and to take a big risk to go, hang out with people who you really looked up to. What kind of advice do you have for young guys these days to make something of themselves?
Yeah. Looking back, it is pretty insane to see like just how much has happened in the last 6.5 years since I started the company that I run, Settlage Strength. What originally started as just a way for me to like not have to work at some crappy job that I was working before. For those who I mentioned this a little bit in my conversations with Mark, but I was working at a commercial gym here in town right out of high school and throughout college. I had a whole bunch of jobs throughout my entire college career, and the job at the gym kind of met the requirement of, okay, well, I get some free game to just, go lift for free and I get paid. But the job was so horrible. It was like, I got to find a way to lift for free somewhere else besides here. And so my dad was an entrepreneur when he was in college. And so I figured like, well, I don't really have much else to lose. I could just start training people on the side or providing some value and helping them get stronger. This was way before I started jiu-jitsu. So I wasn't even initially thinking like, okay, I'm going to go all in on helping jiu-jitsu athletes. I would just work with anybody. I think the first client, I guess you could call him an athlete, but the term athlete, I guess, is up for debate sometimes. The first guy I worked with I think he was 77 and he had just had a stroke. And like my friend's mom said, hey, like, I know you're into like working out and stuff. You think you can help this dude? He like just had a stroke. So that was my first client ever. And like, that's kind of how it started. And then it transcended into kind of where we're at today, working with jiu-jitsu athletes all over the world and all these different amazing opportunities that, I get to embark on every single day. And my advice for younger guys would be just like fail as fast as possible and just constantly find more and more opportunities. I think a lot of times these young guys, they see there's like a disconnect between where they're at, which would be level 1, and then the guys at the very, very top, which for simplicity's sake, let's just say are at level 100. And so you're at level 1 and all you see every single day are the guys killing it at level 100. And there's nothing else to give you context for levels 2 through 99. And so they think that if they make the wrong choice going from level 1 to level 2, that they're never going to, have another chance to reach level 100. And I think that's a huge misconception, because if you ask a lot of those guys are at level 100, they would probably tell you that they spent a lot of time at levels 2 through 99, trying all these different things, failing at a lot of different things, but constantly finding new ways to make improvements, constantly finding new ways to kind of tweak things or maybe take things in a new direction that they hadn't thought of before. And through a lot of trial and error and just jumping on as many opportunities as possible, that elevated them to the position where they're at, quote unquote, level 100. And I think that's very true for my own life. I originally graduated high school, was a giant meathead, freaking loved learning about physical therapy and strength and conditioning and all that stuff, and figured like, okay, well, physical therapists, they got that PhD next to their name. I'm assuming that means they got a lot of dollar signs next to their name also. So that seems good enough for me. And so I went into school originally wanting to be a physical therapist. And even still to this day, like the study of physical therapy and how people rehab from some of these atrocious injuries is still very fascinating to me. But in practice, like working at a physical therapy office and all the work that goes into that is just not for me. I'm just not passionate about it at all. And when I was in college, I had an opportunity to work at a physical therapy office as a freshman for a long period of time. And I specifically remember one instance where I had I'd been at school all day, and then I drive from school straight to the physical therapy office. I was exhausted. I was super tired. I was like falling asleep while I was driving. I was a wreck. And I do my shift at the physical therapy office. All the patients leave. So I'm, wiping everything down, putting all the tools and pieces of equipment away. And the head guy who owned the office, he had a stack of paperwork on his desk like this big. It was huge. And he was so excited to go back into his office and start looking at all his patient charts and doing all the follow-up paperwork. And it was just him and I. Like, the lights were off, like everybody was gone. And I knew that this guy was probably going to be in his office for another 2 hours going through paperwork. And he had a smile on his face and was super fired up about it. And I knew in that moment, I was like, there's no freaking way I'm as fired up as this guy over something like this. And that was the moment where I realized I need to figure out something and do something else. And that's what originally had kind of shifted my perspective and made me start to look at pursuing strength and conditioning. And I didn't really know what that meant. Like, I wasn't really familiar with guys in the strength and conditioning industry that did it on a professional level. It was, not that a professional level only means that you work with NFL teams and college teams and all that stuff. But my whole life, I had just looked at guys on YouTube like Mark Bell, Corey Gregory, which were some of these guys who were maybe a little bit more unconventional in how they developed themselves into a leader in the strength industry. And Mark always said, he was broke and then he invented the slingshot, became a meathead millionaire. And I told my dad, when I told him I didn't want to do physical therapy anymore, he's like, well, what are you going to do? You got to do something. And I said, I don't know what I'm going to do, but I pretty much just want to lift weights and get paid. And he basically said, okay, well, how are you going to figure out that? How's that going to work? And he didn't say it in a way of criticism, but just as a very real, counter question of okay, that's great that you want to lift weights and get paid, but you need to have a plan on how you're going to do that. And so then I figured well, this guy, Mark in Sacramento, the super big dude, he's lifting all these crazy weights. He's a meathead millionaire. So maybe I could just learn from him and figure out how he did it. And so over time, that dream to work with Mark and learn from Mark turned into kind of the story that I told at the beginning of the podcast, where I needed an internship for school, got connected with our boy Smokey, then started working at Slingshot. I worked at Slingshot for, I think, 3.5 years, maybe even a little less, maybe a little bit longer. But I worked very closely with everybody at Slingshot for a long period of time, which was amazing. And it really was like a second college education. And that opportunity would have never have even been available if I'd been too scared to step out and just try all these different things. And even if I failed, that's okay, because I'm a college student. I got lots of room for failure, and just kept trying all these things. And so that would be my advice to young guys looking to get into the industry or any industry. Just fail as quickly and as fast as you can and try as many things as possible. And you'd be surprised at what opportunities come your way.
Absolutely.
I like the fail fasting. And then something you said in the beginning that maybe people didn't catch, but both you and I talked about you having been kind of rapid growth. And you were like, yeah, it's crazy what's happened in 6 years. And that seems rapid to us. With a lot of people, if you told them you'll start to have a booming business in 6 years, most people are like, that's a crazy time horizon. If it's not within 6 months, I don't want to do it. And you're probably not even up to 100 yet in your mind. You're probably at like, stage 20. You still got 80 points to go before you feel like you've made it. And I'm sure you're looking at things more in decades than you are in months, like where's my practice going to be in 10 years? And that's a huge thing too, is people just think that you can be this overnight success and not put in the work. I heard you talking on Mark's podcast about what were you saying? It was basically like, if people would, if you could take a pill that would give you all of the stuff like the sleep and the 10-minute walks and the nutrition and everything, it would fly off the shelves, but people just aren't willing to do it. And that's because it's not a pill. It's not immediate. That's the stuff that actually works, the day in, day out grind, the slowness, that I won't see any results for the next few years, maybe even, especially when it comes to business. But eventually that hard work and consistency pays off. And I think in this digital age where we're so immediate, people lose sight of that. They start making content for a month and their brand doesn't take off and they think I'm a failure, move on to the next. But that's not actually a failure. I know you said fail quick, but you got to kind of put some work in for a while.
Yeah, absolutely. My wife and I were just talking about this because we feel like now that since the company has grown and gained some notoriety in our little bubble of the jiu-jitsu community, we were thinking like, it's so freaking crazy to think that this is all like finally showing itself and like the results are here on display. But it started 6 years ago, just making one post every single day, being super awkward on camera, stuttering all the time, probably like misquoting certain articles from Westside Barbell because I didn't like fully understand what was going on, but I felt like confident enough to just, make a video and talk about it anyway. And so to think like 6 years ago, if I watched any of those videos, like I cringe so badly watching some of those old videos, but it just, you have to get started at some point. And even if it's not perfect now, if you wait for it to be perfect, you're going to be waiting forever because nothing is going to be perfect. Nothing is going to be, level 10 content production and like everything's going to look all sick and stuff. It's like, you just got to get started, start posting every single day, and then watch the growth over the next 6.5 years and go from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly the same with like pulling clients. It's like your first one was not the ideal client for you. You're working with elderly individuals when you want to be working with top athletes, but it's not like you were going to, go show up at the 49er stadium and be like, hey guys, you want to be trained by me? It's not going to work. You have to put in the reps. And I think fitness is such a cool thing because we learn that, I think that people who really dive into fitness and learn that you have to do a lot of reps before you ever see a result, that kind of translates into life, which is really cool. You go do curls one time, you're not going to have a nice set of arms. You've got to do curls continually for 6 months before you even see the slightest gain. And then you're like, oh, I got a bicep vein. This is awesome. But you're not going to have 20-inch arms until, you put years of reps in.
That man, that is so true. I think even like with how, if we like dive into training and there's so many different ways that someone can train to get stronger. But if you look at all the information on strength training, most of the information points to you're going to spend a lot of time not doing maximal stuff. And then a couple times a year, you'll do something maximal. And that's where the results show for themselves. Right. And I think people are starting to understand a little bit of that when it comes to training in the gym. But that's the same lesson for life. Like most of your time, probably 70 to 80% of your time in life is going to be doing non-maximal stuff. So that way, when you have the 20% of the opportunities or moments in life where it's like, okay, it's time to it's time to show up and put all that work on display, you'll be ready and prepared for it.
Yeah, exactly. Josh just did a presentation for us over at Marek on endurance training. We were talking about ramping up for clients. And one of the questions is like, how long, because he does a lot of endurance and, how do we gauge people through this? And, he was talking about getting them to just do 10-minute walks for 3 months before ever going into zone 2, and
I love that.
that's slow. You tell somebody like, you're going to do 3 months of just walking before we ever get you to start doing a light jog. And most people just aren't ready for that, but that's just how life goes, do the reps.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And I think too, it's so easy nowadays just to I guess get lost in the sauce, if you will. Like if you don't come from like an academic background and you don't have the PhD by your name, like you might feel like, oh, like I don't necessarily have the skill set to offer much like in this space or offer the same level of content or programs that others do that are, technically schooled in this. But there also is so much that you learn through just immersing yourself through it and actually doing it and living it out. And I know for me personally, that's been something that's been huge. Is like just through the years of experience, like I get more than that probably than I ever would just continuing to research for years and years and years. So probably another good thing for people to realize as well, like, hey, just you doing it yourself and living out the principles that you preach, like you'll gain so much valuable knowledge that you can share with others that you never would just for, trying to, I guess, school yourself up to a certain level that you might be trying to match others that you see online in the space.
Yeah, absolutely, man. You bring up an amazing point. I think because now, if you want to, I'm not exactly sure what the most appropriate term would be, but evidence-based training or it's kind of even cringy to say science-based training, whatever that means. But I think you guys know what I'm referring to. Like these, there's so many great figures in the industry now that are putting out tons and tons of information and are great at providing all of the research and the studies to back up what they're saying, which is awesome. And we definitely need that. But I think a lot of young guys are discouraged by that because they think like, oh, like I'm a freshman in college and I originally signed up for business, but I love lifting weights. So do I need to go back and change my major to then be pre-med? And then It's like, you don't have to worry about any of that stuff. Like some of the greatest strength coaches who have ever lived, like Louis Simmons, was just some crazy guy who worked construction all day and would squat 800 pounds and had the craziest gym ever. That guy had no degree. I don't even know if Louis Simmons graduated high school, to be honest, but that guy was brilliant. And he is one of the pioneers in the strength and conditioning industry. And he had no official education. And not to say that, there are pros and cons to that for sure. But to have that be a deterrent for someone to get into the industry or at least dip their toes in the water of, okay, how can I start actually using this stuff? Not like just reading about it or like being an abstract bro and just reading all the abstracts and going from there. But how can I actually start applying this stuff for my own life? Maybe like I have a group of guys that I lift with. We try this stuff together, see what works, see what doesn't, and then just come at it from a humble perspective of, hey, I'm not a PhD, but look, we did 8 sets of 2 on banded squats and we got really freaking explosive and it helped us out. So, maybe it can help you out.
Yeah, we just had that conversation with Justin Harris. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, bodybuilding coach. Yeah, he, I just re-listened to it because I was making a reel off of a point that I said where, I'll go into the gym these days and I see a kid who has, like 145 on the bar and he's got fractional plates and a notebook out. And it is cool. Like, okay, he's doing things very evidence-based. He's learning progressive overload. But I do think they're missing something when they're just not loading up a ridiculous amount of weight and trying to push through it with their friends and, just doing stupid stuff to get a pump and just getting dirty. And everything now is like they start from the beginning doing everything perfectly. Their meals are perfect with the macros. They've got their notebooks, their fractional plates. And I'm like, you're missing out on a lot of growth that you have when you're guy friends and you just go freaking train really hard, balls to the wall. And then he had pointed that out that, he feels like you learn more through failures, like basically like what you just alluded to earlier. You learn more from failure than you do success. And these days with the plethora of information, it's just success after success. I'm hitting every rep perfectly and stopping at the exact, and it's like, you're not learning much, you didn't do like Lou Simmons and just push yourself through grueling workouts and really figure out what works. You know what I mean?
Absolutely, man. I was having this conversation with a friend of mine. So I have a group of guys that we lift with in the morning. All of us train jiu-jitsu. Not everyone is a serious full-time competitor, but we all train jiu-jitsu and we're all meatheads and love lifting. So we get together a couple times a week and lift in the morning. And one guy in the group, Zach, him and I have been training partners since we were in middle school. And so we've been lifting and training and wrestling and doing jiu-jitsu together for over a decade at this point. And we've talked about how, like, dude, remember how freaking dumb some of those workouts are? Like, I still have my workout journal from way back in the day. They were so stupid. Like, there was no plan in any of those workouts except for like the number 100 sounds a lot better than doing 3 sets of 10. So let's do 100 reps because that sounds like freaking sick. And we were talking about that, and just like, sure, were those things, in line with what current science would say is optimal for a specific adaptation? Probably not. But what we learned, like, we had the opportunity and we had the youth on our side to just like go nuts in the gym and just like crush ourselves and bounce back the next day and be like, oh, I'm 15. I feel totally fine. Like nothing happened yesterday. And now, we're both 26 and we both feel like we can't do that anymore. We can't afford, I mean, we're still like very young and recover very quickly. We're not old by any stretch of the imagination, but we just don't bounce back like a 15-year-old who's like on the tail end of puberty that has time to just train all day, eat whatever, and just enjoy and have fun doing dumb stuff in the gym. We just don't have the freedom to enjoy that anymore. And I think if a lot of people miss those important stages of their athletic development, they really kind of shoot themselves in the foot later in life. And I mean, it'd be interesting to see kind of how this whole generation of young lifters progresses, but I would guess that they lose the love for lifting and potentially lose the love for fitness later in life because they just get tired and fed up with making sure it's at 7.5 RPE and making sure that they, did this specific percentage. Oh, I didn't, optimize my recovery, so I need to change this workout. That stuff's important, but if you only have your perspective of fitness, you only have your perspective of health through that very narrow lens, my guess would be that you lose the love for it later in life. And that would be fairly tragic.
Yeah,
completely agreed.
Yeah, huge point. And I mean, I'm sure like for all three of us, like when we were young and started doing this, it simply was just because it was fun to push yourself like that with your friends and like do dumb shit and just go in there and go balls to the wall. And like, that's what developed that lifelong love for fitness, right? And yeah, it's a great point, Josh. If you don't develop that and do everything through such a scientific and structured lens, that there's probably no way to ever develop it. You eventually get burnt out, and it's probably much easier to fall off the bandwagon, which for all of us now, it's like no matter if you stay with jiu-jitsu or transition to some other style of fitness down the road, like you'll still find a way to have that passion about it, just because pushing yourself and, immersing yourself into something new that's physically challenging is always very rewarding.
100%. 100%.
Yeah. Another thing that I've noticed too over I've been in this space for 15 years now. Usually what's considered bro science at one point becomes actual science, eventually, like, a lot of the bodybuilders and stuff, people will be like, oh, those bros. And I'm like, well, it's obviously working. Look at these guys. Nobody on earth is as good at putting on mass as they do. And then 5-10 years later, something comes up where science says supersets are, optimal compared to, and they're like, yeah, those guys have been doing it the whole time, and everybody thought they were just stupid bros, which is just silly. So, and that same thing happens in like our medicine space, like, a lot of what people say is quackery because it's not evidence-based, it ends up being like, well, 5 years down the line, maybe those guys were right. So I've now approached everything in life with a much more open mind to where I'm not going to really knock on somebody if it's working for them,
You bring up such a great point, and kind of to circle things back to Mark Bell, that was the biggest lesson that I learned from Mark, is keeping an open mind to some of this stuff. Because when I had come into first working under Mark and just had all these great opportunities to train with him for a period of time, but just talk to him every single day. Mark has such an open mind to all sorts of stuff. And Mark, if you will find you can really get ahead on what's going to be hot in the industry just by listening to who Mark has on his podcast 6 months before they really pop off, or even a year before they pop off, or even some concepts that seem really, really freaking weird. And I'll be honest, like there was some stuff that Mark was telling me. He'd send me a link to some obscure YouTube video about some guy doing some like rotational exercise. And I'm thinking like, Mark, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not going to lie. This looks pretty whack to me. And I would never tell him that to his face. I'd just say like, oh yeah, that's kind of cool. And then sure enough, a year later, like that form of training, that's like the new craze. Everyone is like, we need to use landmines and talk about the spinal engine and all this stuff. I think like, gosh, dang it, Mark was right again. And I think that is so important, having an open mind. And I'm probably going to butcher the Bruce Lee quote, but Bruce Lee has an amazing quote, essentially talking about like, take in everything you possibly can, keep what's useful, get rid of everything else that's not, and then move on, and then just keep running that process over and over and over again. If you get so caught up in the dogma around like, well, is there a study to back this up, or is this optimal for this? It's like, look, did it work for you? Can you replicate those results with the athletes that you're working with? Oh, you did? Great. Then hang on to it until it stops working anymore. And then as you're hanging on to that, continue bringing in new stuff, keep what's useful, get rid of what isn't, and just run that process over and over and over. And you really get to expand the tool chest, if you will, of all the different ways that you can help not just yourself as an athlete, but the athletes that you work with. And keeping an open mind to those things is probably like like I said, the biggest lesson I ever learned from Mark.
Yeah, Mark is so good at that. I learned that all through, my schooling and residency. Attendings would always tell us, and when you go out and you're doing surgeries with other doctors, like, what they might be doing, you might not like, but pick up the things that you do. And we work with all these different attendings, all these different specialties. I've learned things from, bariatric surgeons and plastic surgeons. You just take a little piece of what you like, and sometimes you don't like what they're doing. You see it, okay, and but everything works that way: business, fitness, medicine, etc. And Mark's really good at that. He's very, very open-minded. And these days, so many people are so dogmatic in every part of life. We've got two-party system, and if you're not in the middle, or if you're not on one side, you're just, you kind of get excluded. Everything is that way: religion and politics and fitness. And it's crazy, but Mark is really cool in that way. And I think if we all could do that, it would help us a lot. And another thing I was going to touch on too is like business, fitness, all of it. It's all, it's all like a practice, right? Like we never have it all figured out. I just had this conversation with my wife earlier, and hope she doesn't mind me calling her out, but we do nutrition coaching as well through Atlas, and she's working with a client, and she sends me over her plan that she had for him. And she's like, I don't know why, I'm just kind of doubting myself today. Do you think this works? And I'm like, I don't know, put it out there. Like, this is the practice of nutrition coaching. Like maybe it won't work, and we'll see, but how are you ever going to know unless we try it with this client? And we'll see if this protocol that we put him on works. If it doesn't, then we adapt. And that's how it is with all businesses too. You can't know the formula. Like you didn't know what you guys were doing when you started Settlage Strength. It's like, let's see what works. We'll figure it out as we go along. We're going to practice, and I'm sure you evolve every single day.
Absolutely. That's something that I think is like a tried and true lesson that's people probably have been talking about for the last like 10,000 years, but it seems like every generation just needs to get hit in the face with that lesson over and over and over again. I'm in the process of reading Winning by Tim Grover for the second or third time. And what I read yesterday, he just threw something in there where he would give Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen beer, like the first thing after some of their basketball games. And that is so crazy to think about and so unconventional. But they also got 6 championship rings. So I don't really know, like, how much we could really poke holes in that theory, because the results speak for themselves. And who knows how much that really affected and improving their performance to win 6 championships, or if that was just, a side thing that was helpful for them. But you're right. Like there's so many things that, maybe on paper don't exactly match up, or maybe on paper they do match up, but at the end of the day, they're just on paper. And we have to put those in practice, give them a shot. If it works, great. If not, move on, find a better solution, test that, and keep running that process over and over.
And find out what
works
best for you.
What's his reasoning for the beer after games? That's a book I've been meaning to read, but so spoil that part for me.
So he actually doesn't say the reason why. He in the chapter is basically just talking about the whole book is amazing, and it's about the basically the psychology of winning and some of these extreme winners like Kobe Bryant, Michael Jordan, and how intense they were with all these different things. And one of the lessons, or like the rules of winning, is that winning requires you to be different, and you're going to catch a lot of heat for being different, but it's not about catching the heat. It's about actually winning. And so he just used that as an example where he got tons of flack and tons of hate by a lot of people on staff at the Bulls saying like, you can't give them beer. Like that's not supposed to be good for them. And he said like, look, like they're playing great. Like Dennis Rodman technically shouldn't be out doing what he's doing, but every time he comes back, he always smokes everybody on
in Vegas for 5 days before a game. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's basically what he was referring to. He didn't give the reasoning on why beer was part of their protocol, which I'm more interested to learn the reasoning behind that. But yeah.
Maybe it's just a small reward thing, right? You go out there and do what you're supposed to, and it's just, hey, I've earned this, and I want a little creature comfort here type of thing.
Yep. So yeah, could be. Very well.
I know some bodybuilders will be like drinking backstage and they feel like it helps them to be leaner, but also probably looser on stage to be able to hit poses a little bit better and stuff. It's interesting.
That's a good point because I don't know if you guys remember when Chris Duffin was doing his tequila and deadlifts craze, he would use the tequila between top sets of deadlifts as a central nervous system stimulant. And so that was interesting. I've never tried that myself, but I've also never, deadlifted 1,000 for 3 reps. So maybe that theory holds some water.
There's also some Russian athletes that I think they were like Olympic lifters who would take like oral steroids with a shot of vodka and like swish it around their mouth to help the permeability. So they're getting more of an acute response to it.
Interesting. Okay.
Kind of interesting. I don't think that's what they were doing, but we're just talking about all the different alcohol uses in fitness. But yeah, man. So with your business now, you focus mainly on BJJ, right?
Correct. Yeah. So we essentially what we do, and this is what I preach over and over and over again, is we just help jiu-jitsu athletes win more matches and get injured less in whatever context we can help them in. And mainly that refers to strength and conditioning training and education. There's a huge problem in the jiu-jitsu community as a whole on this resistance, I guess you could say, pun intended, to strength training. And people think, jiu-jitsu is great because it was displayed in the UFC as something like, a smaller guy could submit and take out a much larger untrained opponent. And that was great until all the jacked guys started training jiu-jitsu and started beating up on all the skinny guys in jiu-jitsu. If you watch the growth of the UFC, Royce Gracie really put jiu-jitsu on the map with UFC 1, 2, and 3, and that was awesome for jiu-jitsu. But then you had these super jacked guys like Matt Hughes start learning some of the basics of jiu-jitsu, and he was a pretty bomb wrestler as well. And then when Matt Hughes and Royce Gracie fought, Matt Hughes smoked him, and he was so jacked and so crazy strong. You'd always like pick dudes up, run across the cage and throw them down. And so even with like very real evidence like that available to us, the jiu-jitsu community is still very resistant to the idea of strength training. There's all these misconceptions about strength training. A lot of jiu-jitsu athletes think that strength training is going to make them stiff and inflexible, which is not true. They think it's going to kill their conditioning, which that's not true. They think it's going to make their technique worse because they're going to rely on strength. And the funny thing about that is that strength is only going to enhance whatever technical skills you already have. So if you've built a foundation being a weak, skinny guy on having poor technique, well, when you get stronger, you're just going to be a strong guy with poor technique. But if you're a weak, skinny guy and you really focus on dialing in your technique, making sure that every position that you're in and every submission is applied correctly, just imagine how much more effective you'll be once you get stronger. And then the other thing that's very important is that jiu-jitsu is a sport that is literally designed to do the opposite of everything your body's supposed to do. If your elbow bends in this range of motion, the goal is to find that elbow and bend it in the opposite range of motion. So as you can imagine, there are tons of injuries in jiu-jitsu. And as a whole, the sport hasn't developed to a point where there's a lot of good information or a lot of good resources for athletes to properly recover from injuries, balance the strength and conditioning side with the skills training side. And that's essentially what we do. So myself and my wife and some of the other people we work with, our main goal is to help as many jiu-jitsu athletes win more matches and get injured less through sound strength and conditioning training that is specific to the demands of jiu-jitsu, that is going to not take away from their jiu-jitsu training, but help them. And that's really what I'm passionate about. I've been doing jiu-jitsu since 2017. I wrestled for a very long time before that. And I've been in this been involved in grappling sports for a long time. And it's just like my favorite thing in the world to help these grappling athletes compete and get them ready for competition. And then, regardless of how they perform at competition, it'd be great if they won everything all the time, which isn't always guaranteed, but at least making sure that they aren't constantly injured, because that's a huge thing we see nowadays. If you look at any black belt who's over 50 years old, they'll probably say that like, oh, I can't really do that anymore because I got injured, or I can't really like, oh, I can't roll over my, I can't do a forward roll or a backward roll like that on my neck anymore because I got injured. And that sucks. Like, that's super scary for me. That's probably my biggest fear, is to get so wrecked in an activity that I love for the first 20 years of performing that sport, that the next 30 years of trying to do that sport is just full of pain and frustration and dissatisfaction. So we really focus on helping jiu-jitsu athletes maximize their strength. If they're competitors, definitely making sure we're improving their explosive power, developing their conditioning specific to the demands of jiu-jitsu, all while helping them decrease the risk of injury.
That's awesome. I'm sure a lot of our listeners want to get into the technical stuff, which I will, but that also plays into the philosophical question that I want to answer, or I want you to answer, if you can. Why do you think jiu-jitsu has gained such a massive popularity recently? I know you're probably one of the more OGs because you come from that grappling background, but in the past maybe 2 years, I've just seen it seem like, it's exploding. Every client that comes through Marek is doing BJJ. Our listeners do BJJ. We had Jason Khalipa on, and people were like, yeah, you guys need to do BJJ. Like, listen to him, because everybody loves it. Why do you think that is? What's going on?
I think there's that's a great question. And I think there's a lot of things that contribute to it. And I think it's because it is, at least from my perspective, the most accessible combat sport for the widest population. Wrestling is definitely a young man's sport. The best wrestlers in the world started when they were 4, wrestled all the way up until they were in their 30s, maybe early 30s, and then they retired and then never wrestled again. Maybe they like coached or were still involved in the wrestling industry, but they definitely did not compete anymore. And wrestling is so physically intensive and brutal, and it's just way more explosive than an activity like jiu-jitsu. And so if you're 40 and you're like, I want to try wrestling, it's like, well, unless you were a great athlete before you turned 40, it's probably not going to turn out great for you trying to like pick someone up and slam them, or like run your chest or run your forehead through someone's chest. You'll blow your Achilles off the bone shooting these super explosive takedowns. But jiu-jitsu it was very popular with the creation of the UFC, like to see a smaller guy submit a bigger guy. That's a pretty attractive thing, especially for a lot of people that I would say like have confidence issues or feel like they're not the biggest, jackedest dude ever. They think like, oh, like, wow, that's something I might be able to do and learn, and maybe can like be on par with some of these bigger guys. But it's also, I think, because a lot of these other combat sports, the risks are so much more obvious. You look at something like wrestling, someone could throw you on your neck and that is going to suck for the rest of your life. In boxing, there's tons of stuff coming out about CTE and the effects of that they have, like cardio kickboxing, which I think for some people is a good in between, but for others are like, I don't want to do a cardio kickboxing class. Like, I actually want to develop skills that will help me be able to properly defend myself, and I can develop confidence in knowing like I might not be like the biggest badass in the world, but I'm at least able to take care of myself. And I think jiu-jitsu is that great middle ground. It's not as intense and physically demanding as wrestling. It's also not as obviously dangerous as something like kickboxing or boxing. And it's way more laid back than both of those things. Jiu-jitsu, right. What's really interesting about jiu-jitsu, and at least from my perspective, I'd come from a wrestling background, started doing jiu-jitsu, and the most interesting thing is that there's no pressure. I mean, for most places, some schools nowadays are just fully dedicated to training competitors, which is freaking awesome. But I'd say 90% of the jiu-jitsu schools out there aren't focused on breeding competitors to win world championships. It's just something that you do. And I think a lot of times, like with the craze of and the rise in popularity of powerlifting, that was kind of similar in the sense to jiu-jitsu. You know, powerlifting got really popular after everybody was doing CrossFit, but there was this big intensity component to CrossFit. There was this big push to do the open. There was this big push to do all these, like, just be super competitive. And I don't think that necessarily was for everybody, but people liked getting stronger. People liked getting in better shape. And they're like, oh, I could just squat, bench, and deadlift. I don't have to do a meet if I don't want to, but I can at least enjoy this time with my friends and get stronger. I think jiu-jitsu is very similar in that they looked at all these different combat sports and they saw jiu-jitsu as one of like, hey, I could just improve these skills with my friends. I don't have to compete if I don't want to. I still get I get to scratch that competitive itch a little bit because there is like live rolling and live sparring for every class. But if I don't want to like dedicate the next 10 years of my life to be a world champion, I don't have to, and there's no shame in that. So I think there's a lot of factors that contributed to the rise in popularity of jiu-jitsu. And you said that I would be considered an OG, which is funny because I still feel like I'm like the new guy on the block. Like, hey guys, like I don't want to step on any of your toes. I know I haven't been around in the game as long as you have, but it's so awesome to see like all my friends starting jiu-jitsu and them being like, man, like you've been doing this forever. I think like I don't feel like I've been doing it forever, but I'm just glad you're here to do it with me.
I've been kind of thinking of it on an even deeper level, thinking of like, one of my favorite books and then movie, Fight Club. I'm sure you guys have seen Fight Club.
Yes,
and sir. I feel like men are kind of at a point where the narrator is in Fight Club to where, he's sitting there looking around his house and he's like, man, I know what a duvet is. Why do I know what a duvet is? And with us, Brad Pitt's telling him like, what purpose does that serve you as a man? Why do you know what that is? And, have you ever been in a fight? And he says, no. It's like, well, I don't want to die without any scars. Do you? And like, the way that life is set up now, men don't, we have this biological urge to be primal and aggressive and probably display some violence. And society doesn't really allow us to do that. And I think over the past few years, especially with COVID shutting people down and not even allowing them to go to the gym to get out some of that energy, men just had this big push because during that same time was the Me Too movement and kind of the demonization of masculinity. And now suddenly I think guys are just needing a way to get some of that out. And I think, like BJJ is a lot more graceful, easier way for a not so fit individual to go in and display a little bit of controlled aggression and violence and not have to get punched straight in the face. You know what I mean? So I'm kind of like, that was my running theory with, maybe that's why everybody's just flocking to this because we need to get some of this out. Same with like carnivore diet. There's something very appealing to be like, I just want to get rid of all this shit around me because it's, everything is so synthetic and artificial. And I'm in this cubicle and I've got this bright blue light. I never go outside. I just want to, eat an animal and go wrestle with a dude, and I think, I feel like I understand why people are moving that way.
It's pretty interesting to have conversations with a lot of these new guys that come into jiu-jitsu, especially post-COVID. I remember pre-COVID, I didn't see as many new people coming in as often. And that may have just have been the times that I was going to jiu-jitsu. So maybe like most people were coming after work. I was training in the middle of the day. It could have just been that kind of coincidence. But post-COVID, we have tons and tons and tons of people coming in, trying it out. Like I hardly recognize anybody now when I go to class, which is sometimes it's like, it's a bummer because I miss training with like some of the guys that I've been training with for years, but it's also amazing to see this new flood of guys and women coming in too. And I ask them and like, for those who are unfamiliar with jiu-jitsu, you kind of have two factions. You have gi jiu-jitsu, which is where you wear the pajamas, you got your gi and your belt and all that stuff. And then you have no gi, which you wear like a rash guard that you would wear in surfing and maybe some swim trunks or something like that. And if you're training no-gi jiu-jitsu, no one wears a belt. So you don't always know the rank of somebody. It could be a black belt or it could be a white belt. You don't really know. So it's usually common practice. If you see someone new in no-gi, you just ask them like, hey, how long have you been training and all this stuff? And I kid you not, probably like for the last 3 months, every single person I've asked has been like, this is my first day, or like, I've only been here a week. And that is so freaking cool because like to see people getting excited about trying this thing and diving right in and just saying like, I know I'm probably going to get smoked pretty good for, the next couple of weeks, when really in reality you get smoked the entire time and you make incremental progress from there. But to see them take that step forward and put themselves out there to try something like jiu-jitsu is just absolutely amazing. It's been awesome to see the influx of people coming in and trying it. And it's been freaking awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it reminds me of, like Fight Club, like all those guys so excited to just go fight because they're like, this is an answer that I've been looking for because I've just been stuck in this treadmill of monotony and keeping in a lot of my primal urges, and we all find that in different ways, but I do think that over the past few years, like we got suppressed in so many ways. You couldn't even go out on a trail to hike in a lot of the times, you know? So I didn't even think about it until honestly we were talking, but I'm like, I think that's maybe what's going on here. Cause I've been wondering, I literally don't have a day that goes by. I see about 20 patients a day. I don't have a day that goes by where not at least 3 to 5 of them say that they're doing BJJ as their main, it's just crazy. Everybody's doing it. I'm sure most of our listeners are BJJ. Josh and I have had this conversation. We're almost being peer pressured. We're like, I don't know if I want to do it, but it seems like we have
to. just give it a shot. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure you guys would absolutely eat it up and love it.
This episode is brought to you by Marek Health. As you know, at Atlas, we're extremely passionate about optimizing all aspects of the human condition. And we believe that starts with one's health. But before we start optimizing, we need to know what we're optimizing for, and we need to know where you're starting. That's why we partner with Marek Health, where you can stop guessing about your health status and actually get a look under the hood. Marek was co-founded by our friend Derek over at More Plates, More Dates as a place where the individual could take their health into their own hands. Marek is a telemedicine company that uses blood work and other metrics to provide valuable insights into how your body is functioning and what might need to be changed in order to improve your performance and longevity. With Marek Health's comprehensive lab tests, you'll receive biomarker feedback with actionable steps to improve your metabolism, your libido, your mood, cognitive function, and so much more. Once you get your labs done, your personal health coach will find a licensed medical provider in your state that can help you to develop a treatment plan. So we worked with Marek to provide our listeners with 2 panels. You can go over to marekhealth.com/Atlas and order our panel for 10% off using code ATLAS. Choose Atlas Lab Panel and pair it with a lab review from a health coach for a thorough analysis of your results. That's marekhealth.com/Atlas and use code ATLAS at checkout. You can also order your own desired labs and use code ATLAS to get 10% off your first order. And that took me so long to film, so please go do that, guys. Yeah, I'm sure I would too. It'd be a lot of fun. I can't do anything like, half-ass. I'd be 110% into it. I would probably start spending too much money on all kinds of crap and just watching YouTube videos nonstop.
Bro,
I'm always that way.
That's the danger of it. You could see I started jiu-jitsu in the middle of college when I was a sophomore, and you could see my GPA plummet after I started jiu-jitsu because I got like way into it. I would start like skipping classes to go and get extra training in and all this stuff. And I remember having like a come to Jesus moment thinking like, I need to graduate in 2 years. I probably should like try to find a better, not work-life balance, but like school jiu-jitsu balance to make sure I still graduate on time. Because you definitely get roped in and hooked pretty quick. So for, I'm sure, half of our listeners that are huge fans of BJJ, what kind of stuff can they be doing outside of the mats? I think you brought up a big point that there's, you like with anything, like Josh is a runner, but he still continues to do a lot of resistance training because he feels like it helps him out in that sport. So what kind of things would you be telling your guy who wants to get better at BJJ? What do you do outside the mats? Other than sign up for your training, of course. Yeah, absolutely. www.thestrengthmatrix.com.
Perfect plug.
The number one thing that any jiu-jitsu athlete can do off the mat to improve their performance on the mat is going to be to get stronger. I'm sure we've all seen that meme template of that guy with the card table that has some crazy statement and then change my mind. Yeah. And so I think that meme is perfect for the jiu-jitsu community for what I'm about to say next, which no athlete has ever lost a match or gotten injured because they were too strong. There's this weird backhanded compliment in jiu-jitsu that people will say where they're like, man, you're really strong, as in like you're strong and you only beat me because you're stronger, not because you're better at jiu-jitsu. And that's so freaking dumb, in my opinion. That's like you're right. I am stronger. You should probably get stronger too. Yeah. But no one ever lost a match because they were too strong. No one ever got injured because they were too strong. And the number one thing you can do off the mat to improve your performance on the mat would be to get stronger. And there's a couple of reasons why. A lot of times people will say like, well, what about conditioning? Shouldn't I work on conditioning? It's like, look, you go to a 90-minute jiu-jitsu class 5 days a week. I think your conditioning is just fine for right now, but you still can't do a pull-up. There's a big issue there that we need to work on. So let's work on getting your pull-ups up. If you end up being able to do 20 pull-ups and you can't finish a single round of jiu-jitsu, then I'm wrong. You're right. We should have just focused on conditioning the entire time. But I still have yet to see that happen. A lot of jiu-jitsu athletes have the concern that strength training is going to take away from their flexibility. Some jiu-jitsu athletes aren't that flexible and their game is not flexibility based. And there are jiu-jitsu athletes that are crazy flexible and they rely on that a lot as one of their assets to move their legs into certain positions, or maybe opened up different situations on the mat that someone else who isn't as flexible wouldn't be able to get to. And so they have this concern that, oh, well, if I'm getting stronger, does that mean I'm going to get tighter and less flexible? And that's only true if you just start neglecting your own flexibility and mobility training. Strength training is great for enhancing your mobility in a variety of ways. But if you're not training in specificity to the demands of jiu-jitsu, yeah, you may lose some of your mobility if you just neglect all of that. A lot of jiu-jitsu athletes are concerned that their strength training is going to take away from their technique, which is just not true. It's only going to enhance whatever technical qualities you already have. And so I often tell these jiu-jitsu athletes, like, they'll come to me and say, hey, like, I keep getting wrecked in training. I'm not doing as well as I want to in competitions, but this is something that's really important to me. It's a huge part of my life. I want to win a tournament. I don't want to be that guy that signs up for a tournament every other month and constantly gets like third place or doesn't even make it to the semifinals. I want to perform better. And so I talk to them. I say, like, okay, well, how are you organizing your training? How many days are you lifting? How many days are you going to jiu-jitsu? And they often say, well, I'm going to jiu-jitsu 6 days a week. Okay, well, what about lifting? It's like, well, I kind of like, I'll do some like pull-ups before class, or I just like follow some stuff on Instagram. And I usually like will try to flip it back around to them. I said, if you're going to be like the best jiu-jitsu athlete ever, how good do you think you could get if you're just like finding all these random techniques on Instagram?
Right.
And maybe before you go to work, you do like a couple sweeps with a partner. It doesn't really work that way. You got to have some dedicated time and some intention into the training. That way you can make those adaptations and become a better athlete. And a lot of jiu-jitsu athletes think that when I say that you need to get stronger, they're assuming that you need some crazy bodybuilding program that's going to be 6 days a week, push-pull legs 2 times a week. And I've only had one athlete that actually wanted to do that. And that's because he was a huge meathead like me. But 99% of the other athletes I work with, they don't want that. And we can get some amazing results just having them lift 2 to 4 days a week. A lot of guys will ask, okay, well, how many days is going to be right for me? And my answer is always the same. Lift as many days as you can, just as long as it doesn't begin to take away from your own jiu-jitsu training. It's not about how much you do. It's about how much you can recover from. So if you're doing tons of jiu-jitsu and no weight training, maybe just start out with 2 days a week. I'm a big fan of doing full body sessions. That way we can spread out the fatigue and the volume across the whole body instead of having your entire upper body blasted on one day and your entire lower body blasted on another day. So that could just be something as simple as, hey, on one day, you're going to do some form of squat. It could be a box squat, goblet squat, front squat, back squat, Zerta squat, whatever kind of squat you want. You should probably follow that up with something that's not a squat for the lower body, like a lunge, a lateral lunge, maybe some sort of hip hinge movement. Then do some stuff for the upper body. Build up your upper body to get jacked, get your back crazy strong. Maybe if you're prepping for competition, you can mix in some explosive work to make sure that you still got that speed and that pop when you need it. Then on the second day, you'll do the opposite. So maybe do something a little bit heavier for your upper body. That could be a floor press, some heavy pull-ups. That could be bench if your shoulders feel good benching, bent over rows, things like that. And then do something fast, explosive, and athletic for your lower body. That could be vertical jumps, standing hops, box jumps. If you have a sled, you can do some really fast sled pushes or sled drags. There's so many different things that you can do, and you don't need to get put into, this, push-pull legs, upper, lower. It has to be like this perfect split, because everything that you do off the mat should contribute and enhance your performance on the mat. And the second that it doesn't, we need to change things up and go back to finding what does work. So that way you can enhance your athleticism specifically for jiu-jitsu.
I'm surprised that that's not just common knowledge. It kind of plays into everything else we've been talking about, all the dogma. CrossFit used to be that way. I know you were a CrossFit athlete, and so was I. Like the hate that they had on hypertrophy training, was like curls. Like if you did a curl in a CrossFit gym, that was, sacrilegious. But then guys were rupturing their bicep tendon because they're doing these bouncing deadlifts. And I'm like, maybe if you did some curls, your bicep tendons would have been a little bit stronger, you know? And
Absolutely, bro.
It's funny. Like, imagine if basketball players or football players only played basketball. You know, every single one of those teams has a gym associated with it, you know, with weights. Even rock climbing, you go to a rock climbing gym and there's always a weight section where they're over there training weights. You know, it's kind of silly to me that you wouldn't just adopt the fact that it's very important to be strong concurrently and work on things that can translate over to your sport.
That's the crazy thing about jiu-jitsu, is that they think that jiu-jitsu is like completely different than all these other sports. Like, oh, the NFL athletes, they got a combine to test their athleticism in these specific ways. And sure, there's arguments against the combine and how effective that is, but still it demonstrates that, hey, you got to be freaking strong. You got to be fast. You got to be explosive. The MLB, they're notorious for wanting to get bigger and stronger, or else no one would have taken steroids. Hockey, same thing. You have all these sports that like place a huge emphasis on, we're going to get jacked and improve our performance. But jiu-jitsu is this one over here in the corner that says like, nah, if we do that, we're going to get worse at our sport. It's going to destroy us. It's the worst thing we could ever do. And that's just silly at the end.
Well, like you said, you can do super sport specific movements too. I mean, you may not feel like a certain, I can't even think of an exercise that wouldn't translate, because I'm in my head every time I get to one, I'm like, no, that would work. No, even a curl, I'm sure I can eventually, sometimes you have to bend your arm, you know, push, a bench, you're going to have to push somebody off of you, a squat, you're going to have to use your legs to heave somebody, you know? So I can't think of one that wouldn't translate, but you can really focus on sports related movements. You know, for example, baseball players will do a lot of the torsional stuff. I don't incorporate a lot of that in, but it would work really well for you. But you know, you can find sport specific things and focus more on those. You don't have to just be doing, you know, curls and tricep push downs, although I think they would be beneficial.
Absolutely. That's our favorite day of the week. And all the training programs that I've built for jiu-jitsu athletes over the years, I always make sure we have some form of what Mark has termed a jacked and tan work, where you're just, that's all you're doing is just like getting your delts freaking rocked out, getting your biceps and triceps looking huge, building a giant back. Like, that stuff is so much fun, and it has a lot of validity in helping decrease your risk of injury. You know, athletes that have more muscle mass are less likely to get banged up than skinny, unmuscled athletes. Having more muscle does contribute to you being able to make greater strength gains in the future. So we're all about getting jacked and tan over here.
Nice. Yeah. And people don't realize that strength training actually improves flexibility. You know, there's countless amounts of studies on that. I don't do hardly any mobility, but I do a lot of strength training, and I'm not that I'm flexible by any means. I'm terrible. And any true mobility expert would be like, you're awful. You're a robot, you know, you look like Tin Man. But I mean, I can touch my toes very easily and stuff, which guys who don't train can't do that, you know? And then you don't have to, being strong doesn't mean that you can't be flexible. I mean, look at like Cali Muscle, that dude's, you know, or not Cali Muscle, Kai Green, the dude with it. Yeah. Kai Green used to do crazy flexibility on stage. We had Juju Mufu, you know, the dude's a bodybuilder and doing splits and flips and everything, you know, like that's probably the most mobile dude you can find. So even hypertrophy, which I would think would be counterproductive, like it doesn't have to be. You can be big and flexible if you maintain your mobility.
Absolutely. 100%.
And Josh, do you feel like, and correct me if I'm wrong here, I'm just thinking it from like a muscular endurance standpoint, that especially with a lot of those full body training styles, like you're improving your ability to clear lactate because you're kind of working a lot of type 2 fibers, just like you would be with jiu-jitsu training, and like just kind of building up that like low end explosive strength. So it almost translates perfectly to where like, hey, if I, you know, work on my upper body in conjunction with my legs at the next movement, like that allows me to clear lactate out of places whenever I'm in a match and getting fatigued. Like, am I correct on that?
Absolutely. That's a huge, one of the biggest demands of jiu-jitsu is your blood lactate threshold. You have to have a high blood lactate threshold to perform well in jiu-jitsu. How much or how high your blood lactate threshold needs to be is going to be dependent on what competition you're competing in. Some competitions have 20-minute matches. Some of them have 10-minute matches. Some of them have no time limit. So it could be like 30 seconds or it could be 3 hours. So regardless, having a high blood lactate threshold is very important for grappling athletes, and being able to spread out the training that you're doing, like you said, is a great way to begin being more efficient at being able to buffer lactate. You're not necessarily like going to get a crazy conditioning engine by doing full body training, but you are making your body much more efficient at being able to better handle that type of stress and that type of fatigue.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's all. Do you guys do much like isometric training? I was just thinking of like, that would probably be beneficial.
Absolutely. So that I think is like one of the good parts of jiu-jitsu's stance on strength and conditioning. They love doing isometric stuff. They love like grabbing like a heavy bag and just squeezing it. And that stuff is great because that can definitely help jiu-jitsu athletes. I'm a huge fan of all the work that Cal Dietz has done with his triphasic training. For those listening who are unaware, Cal Dietz is one of the greatest strength and conditioning coaches on the planet. And he, in his book, Triphasic Training, it describes how you can train each muscle action to have greater athletic performance. So when you're lengthening the muscle, or if you're doing a bicep curl and you're lowering the dumbbell, that's going to be the eccentric phase. When the bicep comes to a dead stop, that's going to be the isometric phase. And then when the bicep is contracting or you're lifting the dumbbell up, that's the concentric phase. And Cal Dietz has a lot of great work showing that if you take some time, 2 to 3 weeks at a time, focusing your training on emphasizing one of those muscle actions, it could lead to greater athletic results over time. You could get stronger, you could be much faster and much more explosive. And so we use a lot of that triphasic training with the athletes that we work with. If they're in their preseason, we do 2 to 3 weeks of eccentric focused training. So that could be something like if you're doing a squat, you're just going to do 7 seconds on the way down, stop at the bottom and come back up like you normally would. Then we'll do 2 to 3 weeks where we do isometric training, where if you're still doing a squat, you go down at normal speed, but maybe you pause at the bottom for 2 to 4 seconds, and then you come up at normal speed. The other way we'll use isometrics is part of our peaking protocol, getting athletes ready for their biggest competition of the year. You have 2 different types of isometrics that you can do. You can do yielding isometrics, which would be like that pause squat, where you're holding a specific position against resistance. But then you also have overcoming isometrics, which is where you're applying force into an immovable object. So that could look like a med ball squeeze. That could look like a bench press into pins. So you're not benching off the pins. You have the bar resting on your chest and you push up a couple inches and it stops against pins. And then you're just pushing as hard as you can against that. That is amazing, not just for stimulating greater strength gains by engaging so much of the central nervous system, but also improving your ability to produce maximum force output for longer periods of time. And sometimes when you have a fully locked in choke, you really need to make sure that you're applying maximum force on that choke. And if you can only apply it for 5 seconds, well, then your opponent, all he has to do is just keep a couple fingers inside, hold out for 5 seconds, escape, and then he's good to go. But if you can expand that time from 5 seconds to 7 seconds, that could be a difference between being able to finish that submission and not finishing that submission. So kind of to circle back to your original point, yes, we are huge fans of isometrics and we use them a lot in our training, especially in our preseason and our peaking phases for competition.
It's awesome.
Like you were saying, Adam, it just seems like this is all so like intuitive, right? Like it makes sense, of course. So it's crazy to think that you've had so much, or there is so much pushback in the community. Since you started in 2017 to now, does it seem like just as the jiu-jitsu community as a whole is much more receptive to these ideas, or is there still a lot of old school way of thinking versus the new school?
So you guys had mentioned that you listened to the podcast that I was on Mark Bell's Power Project the last 2 times. And I am so excited to say that the jiu-jitsu community as a whole has really surprised me with how quickly they've switched and changed their perspective within the last 12 months or so about strength and conditioning for jiu-jitsu. When I first started in 2017 and I started talking about how you can get stronger for jiu-jitsu, I didn't have the platform that I have now. But even the people that I would interact with, there's so much hesitancy to accept or even entertain some of the ideas that I was proposing to them. But now, especially in the competitive scene, people are eating it up and they're really receptive to it, which is awesome for me because I feel like I've done my part in being like, hey, like, okay, yes, we got through the door. Now let's teach you how to do it effectively and maximize the results so you can become a better athlete. I don't have to spend as much time trying to convince you. We can just start getting to work and making you a better athlete. And if you look at some of the most popular competitions that have happened over the past couple of years, One of them is going to be the ADCC World Championships. The Abu Dhabi Combat Club is a tournament that happens once every 2 years, and it's essentially the Olympics of submission grappling sports. So they pull guys from jiu-jitsu, they pull guys from sambo, they pull wrestlers, they pull in MMA fighters. It really is the greatest display of submission grappling that we have as of right now. And the guys that win those tournaments are all crazy jacked. Like there's no guy that's not just freaking jacked out of his mind that wins a gold medal in that tournament. Yeah. And because that tournament has gotten more and more popular, I'd say that's been a huge help in demonstrating and being a prime example to these other jiu-jitsu athletes, showing them like, that guy has a gold medal and he's freaking jacked. Oh, that next lowest weight class down, that guy's freaking jacked, has a gold medal. This guy's a gold medal. Actually, he got 2 gold medals and he's freaking jacked. So there is like some, like the tide is changing, I'd say, and more jiu-jitsu athletes are becoming much more receptive to this type of stuff. And it's great for me because now I can just focus on teaching them how to go about it correctly, how to get the most out of the training that they're doing. So that way we can move forward and help them be better athletes.
Yeah, I was going to say that I bet the new influx in popularity has kind of helped too, because there's probably a lot of people like Jason Khalipa came from a strength background, comes into the sport and does pretty darn well, you know, and Nsima, same thing, like bodybuilding background. There's probably so many stories like that where this jacked gym bro came in to see what it was like. And then, like you said, they go, oh, you're strong, you won. And then eventually they're like, damn, we need to just stop saying they're strong, they won. Like that means something. It translates to what we're doing. Maybe we should start doing some curls too.
Bro, I trained with Nsima Yang, who's a co-host on Mark Bell's Power Project. He, I think he weighs like 250, former natural pro bodybuilder, crazy strong power lifter, and he's a brown belt in jiu-jitsu now. And he's so freaking jacked and so strong. And I have been like, it's been the funnest thing to entertain some of these conversations where people will, back in the day, like when Nsima was a blue belt or a purple belt, people who were maybe purple or brown belts would say like, oh, you train with that guy Nsima? I was like, yeah, he's a cool cat. He's pretty jacked. He's pretty strong. They're like, yeah, you just like, wrecks everybody because he's so strong. And then they'd come in and train with us. And it was just the best thing to see those same guys just get destroyed by Nsima. And Nsima doesn't even, it's not like he's picking people up and like demonstrating all his athleticism by picking them up and slamming them on their head. He's just like, I don't want to say he's slow as in like he doesn't have a fast explosive game, because at times he does, but he's not, you can just tell he's not relying on his athletic development to perform so well. He is so methodical in everything that he does. And it's just awesome to see those guys have to eat their words a little bit.
It's hilarious. I wanted to, or Josh and I both wanted to touch on, I guess, before we leave, since everybody knows us for talking about steroids and TRT and everything, the prevalence or lack thereof, I guess, we don't really know, of jiu-jitsu. I mean, I heard you talking on Mark Bell's that is there a group that basically doesn't regulate it at all and kind of promotes it in a way, or at least says be the best you can be?
There is. What's interesting about jiu-jitsu is that 95% of the competitions available to jiu-jitsu athletes have 0 drug testing. And there's only one primary organization that drug tests. And it wasn't until in December where they really started like taking more action with it. It was just an intelligence test before. There was this whole debacle with athletes that would compete in all these non-tested federations. They'd compete in this one tested federation. Then when it was time for them to take their drug test, they'd say like, oh, I have to fly back to Brazil. Like, I have to fly back to take my test. And so that organization ended up saying like, okay, well, boom, you're banned. We're going to find you at your gym, test you. And, it was this whole ordeal. But regardless of that, that's just one organization. All the other organizations don't test for any PEDs or any steroids. Some organizations are much more open about that, kind of like how Pride was back in the day for MMA. In their contracts, they would say, we will not test. Yeah. Like encouraging them to like, you better come correct because we're not testing you. We're not testing your opponent. So some competitions are like that. And there is a huge influx of athletes in the jiu-jitsu competitive scene that are on PEDs. And this is what I said on Mark's podcast, and I still stand by this. I would say that 90% of athletes that compete in jiu-jitsu probably don't need PEDs. And that's mainly because their recovery practices, their training practices are so rudimentary that they could just get like insane results if they just dialed in their sleep, dialed in their nutrition, and properly organized their training better. That's not saying that they would get those same results over the next 10 years. Maybe, a few years down the line, being on PEDs would be more beneficial to them. But the current state of the way these pro jiu-jitsu athletes are training, so much progress could be made in just how they're training, just how they're eating, and just how they're recovering, that PEDs don't even, in my opinion, don't even need to be part of that conversation. And then if you took all the athletes that were on PEDs, I would argue that for 90% of them, they aren't doing that much to help their performance anyway. Yeah. And we see some great examples of this with athletes who make these huge technical developments. So if I like to equate it back to basketball, I think, was it Phil Jackson that created the triangle defense, and then the Bulls started tearing everybody up? If everyone on the Bulls was on steroids, I don't know. They could have been, who knows? But do you really think that like they were winning as many games because they were all on steroids, or was it because of a technical development in the sport that really changed the game on how the sport is played with the triangle defense? We see that happen in jiu-jitsu fairly often, where there are these trends in jiu-jitsu on a technical standpoint where everybody is going for chokes, everybody is going for, arm bars or shoulder locks. And then you have this group of athletes that not only attack the legs, but really capitalize on the weaknesses in people's legs and start submitting them with heel hooks and knee bars, ankle locks, and things like that. And if both athletes are on steroids, it's so hard to say, like, okay, are the PEDs helping the leg lock guy be way better than the other guy when there's this huge technical deficit that someone else capitalized on? And so I think kind of to circle back around, PEDs are huge. I don't want to say it's a problem in jiu-jitsu. I think people should have the freedom to take whatever they want. And everyone's an adult. So if you're 18 years or older, do what you want. I don't freaking care. But there is an issue with people not having the education and not having the wherewithal to go about that in the most optimal way possible. And I think that's what is really important for jiu-jitsu athletes to understand. Like, look, you're sleeping 4 to 5 hours a night. You train 3 times a day. You hardly eat. And you're talking to me about wanting to like hop on Tren. Like, do you even know what Tren is, bro? These are conversations that I've actually had where someone said like, hey, bro, I'm going to be competing at Worlds this year. I'm a brown belt. I really think this is my year to like put my name out there and like jump on the scene. And I'm thinking about taking Tren. It's like, whoa, let's pump the brakes. How much are you sleeping? Oh, like 4 hours some nights and 6 hours other nights. Okay. And what's your diet like? Well, I just go to In-N-Out after each training session. That's about it. Like, okay. Yeah. Well, before you hop on Tren, you should probably fix some other stuff first. And then we can entertain this conversation. And you really shouldn't be talking to me. You should be talking to someone else who's actually going to, be much more equipped to be able to give you proper information on this stuff. So yeah, long story short, there's tons and tons and tons of PEDs in jiu-jitsu. It's kind of an issue right now in the sense that a lot of athletes are not going about it the best way, but I don't think that means that we need to get rid of PEDs. I think, that's everybody's choice. If an organization is untested and they're very clear and open about, hey, we don't test for anything, then every athlete should be doing everything in their power to try to be as competitive as possible and try to win and just freaking crush the competition. And if that means that they need to use PEDs to get there, then that's great. But they probably shouldn't jump to that step if they've skipped the steps of dialing in their sleep, dialing in their nutrition, and dialing in their training.
Yep, big time. I mean, that was the genesis of this podcast was, I'm a partner provider over at Marek. Josh is a health coach at Marek. And we just, we would see these guys come in who want to jump straight to, I need TRT, which is just the stupidest thing ever too, because that's not steroids. You are shutting down your body, but then you're just replacing it with the normal levels. We're not going to, no medical provider is going to do that. But we were like, both him and I, like, he was a competitive bodybuilder. I was a bodybuilder, CrossFitter. We've both abused PEDs. I have for 10 plus years before transitioning to TRT. And I'm like, this is not what you need. I can tell you that's not going to get you where you want to be. All of the drugs that I did never made me any better at my sport. The things that did were the simple stuff, the eating and the sleeping and the training. I always tell the story that my best year of bodybuilding was on the least amount of drugs and the best. You know, I actually dialed in my sleep, my training, my eating. I made crazy gains, and I was like, oh shit, I could have been doing this for 10 years without abusing all that stupid stuff, you know? And it's funny, things like tren. If you want to do tren I would think that was the worst decision ever.
That's
Those
what I
of
was
us who
thinking
know,
too.
Exactly.
Yep.
Yes.
It's just
The most counterproductive steroid for that type of sport.
And
Yeah,
that's
we
the
were
thing.
talking
They
to,
don't get it.
Exactly. Yeah. We were talking to Jason Kleepa off air after our podcast with him, and we were talking to him about TRT and stuff and the benefits. And he's like, no, that doesn't really like seem like it would benefit me in any way from my sport. And he was like, you tell me something though that will help my recovery and help, like, you know, joints to not ache as much and things. So we're thinking maybe peptides, you know, or growth hormone secretagogues or something may help. But like just the hardcore androgens, maybe in a sense to help with aggression. You know, I could see that being one where you have more aggression and more drive potentially, but there's also a point with a lot of the drugs that it hinders performance. They work great for 3 sets of 10, but even that, if you guys go listen to Justin Harris and I talk about the back pumps that you get when you're training, like I can't imagine how pumped and cramped one might get while doing, you know, jujitsu. If you get locked in a thing where your back is in flexion or something for too long, if you're on a ton of gear, you're going to seize up and then not be able to move, you know?
Yeah.
So, and the electrolyte disturbances that you run into, I'm sure there is a perfect cocktail out there that somebody will come up with, but I don't think it's a ton of hardcore androgens, you know, just.
I think
the perfect go ahead, Josh. I'm sorry.
I think you're good. I think that circles back to what we had mentioned at the very beginning was how I talked with Mark. If there was a pill that had the perfect amount of sleep, the perfect nutrition, all the micronutrients and vitamins and all that stuff, it'd fly off the shelves. Yeah. And I think like in that same conversation, we had talked about how a lot of jiu-jitsu athletes will look at the most popular trigger words when it comes to the PED conversation, and they think like, whoa, well, good enough for powerlifting. You know, I want to be strong as a jiu-jitsu athlete. That's good enough for me. And it's just the PED cocktail for jiu-jitsu just isn't necessarily here yet. And my hope would be that, you know, maybe that comes down the line, but it would come down the line after the entire sport as a whole has gotten to a level where they can respect the importance of just getting in high quality sleep, making sure your training is organized in a way that allows you to maximize your recovery between training sessions. If you're doing one day where you lift your face off and then you do 2 jiu-jitsu sessions and the next day you do that again, it's like, all right, bro, we just need to really go back to the basics here, reorganize everything, make sure your recovery is on point, make sure you're eating enough stuff, make sure all these other factors are dialed in first. And then once the whole sport can kind of like adopt that together, then maybe there is like a PED cocktail that would help jiu-jitsu athletes and, you know, elevate the sport that way. But at this point, we're still a long ways. We have a long ways to go.
Yeah. And I'm thinking of just from a standpoint of like, if you didn't have your aerobic conditioning or any of those things on point, you throw on 15, 20 pounds of muscle mass, you've obviously grown that muscle fiber. Now with the disproportionate, like weaker mitochondria, they haven't grown. And like so it's obviously the ratio is off even more. So I feel like that would negatively impact your performance. Have you seen that with guys that like make that jump and all it does is make them bigger and stronger, but then negatively impact their performance on the mat?
Yeah, absolutely. Some of this stuff I think is I can't confirm with some of these athletes where I suspect that has happened, but you look at statistically how they performed when they were younger, when they were coming up as brown belts and maybe their first couple of years at black belt, their performances are way different than a few years after they've been training at black belt. And how much of that is due to them getting older, which they say is because they're getting older, or because of some of the other pharmaceutical changes that they made to their training per se. It's hard to tell how much of that is kind of where that pendulum swings, but you can definitely see changes in people's performance as they go through these huge, what we would call growth spurts in that sense. And it's kind of like disheartening, to be honest, because there are some guys that you have seen some very big growth spurts where it's very clear to tell, like, it's probably not a surprise if we found out this guy was on gear. He competes in untested competition, so he's not breaking the rules, which is totally fine. And some guys make those jumps and perform great. And I think Gordon Ryan is a great example. Yeah. I personally have never heard Gordon Ryan come out and say, I am on PEDs, but he's very open about the fact that PEDs aren't illegal in his sport. And he's very open about that. And he had a pretty huge, significant growth spurt going into the 2017 ADCC World Championships. And he performed amazing. And his performance has continued to improve over time. And that can't be said for some of the other athletes that have also had big growth spurts. Maybe they had like a really hot year where they performed really well, and then they started tanking off, and they'd have these matches where it's just like a pushing contest. No one, really did anything. They looked like they got gassed out way faster than they did when they were younger. And it really, there's issues with the PED conversation in jiu-jitsu that I think with stuff that you guys are doing with Marek, that could really help a lot of these jiu-jitsu athletes who are misguided and uninformed on how to go about this the right way.
Yeah. Well, and a guy like Gordon Ryan, obviously, I mean, he a world champion before he had that massive growth spurt, or?
He was a world champ in another organization. So jiu-jitsu is a little like powerlifting, like where everyone could be a world champ if they wanted to. But there's only really 2 competitions that solidify those titles. And on the no-gi side of competition, that's ADCC, which Gordon Ryan had that growth spurt and then won his first world title at ADCC. And then on the gi side of things, where you wear the pajamas, that's just the IBJJF World Championships of Jiu-Jitsu. And there's some athletes that have had like similar growth spurts in that sport, but I'm less familiar with those in the gi. I'm way more familiar with the ones in no gi.
Gotcha. And I just asked that because he seems like a guy that probably had everything checked off, all the technique, everything beforehand. So that's kind of the perfect athlete to have, like, all right, here's the cherry on top for you now that's going to give you that rocket fuel, if you will. And I'm sure a lot of guys could benefit from exhausting everything for 5 to 10 years, perfecting their technique. And then, here we're going to give you basically that last missing 10% that you need.
Gordon Ryan is a perfect example for that. And I have to constantly say this all the time online in these comment sections where people think he's only as good as he is because he got crazy jacked, when that's not the case at all. Gordon in other competitions was beating and submitting former world champions before he ever got crazy jacked. He had a goal, at least what he said in interviews, to be the greatest of all time. And part of being the greatest of all time in jiu-jitsu is being able to win your weight class and then win what they call absolute divisions, which is there's no weight. Anyone from any weight can sign up. So sometimes you have these freak show matches where one guy's like 250 and another guy weighs like 145, and that's the first round of the tournament. Like, you just got to deal with it. And Gordon has stated that his goal was always to be the greatest of all time, and it would have been very difficult for him to do that when he only weighed 170 pounds. Even though at 170 pounds, he was still beating a lot of these former world champs and beating a lot of these high-level guys just based on the technical advancements that he had made when training under John Danaher. He has that giant growth spurt, gets crazy jacked, he moves up a weight class, and then that's when he started his reign. He started growing and tearing up every weight class above him over the next 5-6 years.
I think that's the perfect thing to end on, because that's been the recurring theme on, I think, every single one of our episodes, that there's no magic pill. I mean, I think it starts with genetics when it comes to athleticism. Genetics is a big one. There's guys who I don't know what the perfect phenotype is for a jiu-jitsu athlete, but I'm sure there's a body type that works really well, just as there is in basketball, football, bodybuilding, etc. And it's really the core shit. After genetics, it's the hard work. It's the training, the sleep, the dieting, supplementation, all of that stuff. That's 99% of it. And then the 1% helps you. And it translates the same way over into like business, like we started out the conversation with. If somebody just gives you $1 million the first day that you say, I'm going to open a business, that's not a guaranteed way for success. And that's kind of what steroids are. You just start loading yourself up with tren. You haven't learned all the stuff that's going to make you successful. Just like you haven't learned how to read your P&L statements and learn payroll and learn all of this stuff that you would need to have a successful business. Having $1 million in your business account doesn't make you successful, And so, look at Ronnie Coleman. He did his first Olympia drug free. And
Yeah.
a lot of people are very convinced of it, and it wasn't. Then he puts that in and gains 100 pounds of muscle. That's insane. But he learned how to do that before the drugs, and just like you were talking about that jiu-jitsu athlete, same exact thing. So everybody put the hard work in and learn how to work hard. I say when I was lying to myself, I would be sitting there doing CrossFit, and I'm like, I'm 15 reps in and I drop the bar and I think, oh, I'm dropping the bar right now. I'm not as good as Froning because he's got better growth hormone or steroids or whatever than me. But no, it's because Froning, when things got hard, he didn't drop the bar. He pushed it until he got to the 21 reps and kept going. He figured out the training. He worked his ass off. He slept well. He ate well. He did everything right. Did he do drugs? I don't know. But I'm convinced people like Khalipa would have been just as good as they were, natty or not. It doesn't really matter. Because Josh and I, I don't know your stance, Josh, but Josh and I are very open with all of our use, and we'll say it didn't really do much for us. It was everything else. I was always disappointed with all of the drugs that I did. They weren't the magic pill. The magic pill was the exercise, sleep, and diet.
Yeah. To your point, I think you're absolutely right. Like whether it's in CrossFit, whether it's in bodybuilding, whether it's in jiu-jitsu, if there is a way you could like Dr. Strange everybody and make everybody natural, the lineup would look exactly the same. Yeah. I'm pretty sure we could all agree on that. Like the number one guy on gear is going to be the number one guy off gear. The number one guy in this sport over here that's running the craziest stuff ever, and his number one would probably still be number one if everyone else was natural. So I think that's a really important thing that athletes and spectators need to understand and recognize. Like, look, you can appreciate someone's skill. You can appreciate someone's competitive drive. You can appreciate all the discipline that goes into getting to that level. And there's like the added, suspicion maybe for tested sports, or the very clear signs that like, oh, this guy's not natural, but he has 9 other variables and factors that he maximized to get to the dance. And, maybe the PEDs helped him, perform just a little bit better, but they didn't make him as great as he was.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thanks so much, Josh. It was awesome having you, man. Where can our listeners find you?
This has been great, you guys. Thank you so much. You guys can find me on Instagram at Joshua Settlage. You guys can find me on YouTube at Joshua Settlage or Settlage Strength. And for any jiu-jitsu athlete that's listening to this podcast, I have a free 4-week strength program that you could use to get started. We've had over 40,000 athletes already download this program to begin learning on how they can begin taking the first steps to building strength specifically for jiu-jitsu. You guys can check that out on Instagram or YouTube, or go to my website, www.thestrengthmatrix.com. You guys can get that free 4-week strength program and get started.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Josh. It was a lot of fun, and we'll have to do another one in the future.
I would love to.
Definitely.
Let's do it.
All right. Thanks, guys. We'll see you next time. Cool. All done.
Awesome.
That was awesome, man. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. That was arguably like one of the greatest online podcast experiences I've ever had. Like, this was really, really awesome. You guys did an amazing job, and I just really appreciate you guys having me on the show.
Let me get that sentence out before I hit end record. Now I'm hitting it. That's going live.
There we go.